Now he says, I have confidence in you through the Lord, that ye will be none otherwise minded, but he that troubleth you shall bear his judgment, whosoever he is. Now, Paul here believed that the Galatians would ultimately reject, I think, the teaching of the Judaizers. He says, I have confidence in you, that when you get your feet back down on the ground and your head out of the clouds, and you begin to go back to the gospel that was preached to you, you'll see that this is an intrusion, that this is leaven that's been put in. Verse 11, and he says, and I, brethren, if I yet preach circumcision, why do I yet suffer persecution? Then is the offense of the cross ceased. Now this is, I believe, a very important thing to note here. He says, if I preach circumcision, why am I persecuted? You see, the preaching of something to add to the gospel makes it acceptable. The gospel by itself is not acceptable to the natural man. I've had any number of people that have told me, and I think that's been the value of radio, that you can tune me out. Right now, any of you can just turn the button and you're through with me. I know that. I recognize that, but I'm not trimming the message down because I know something else, that there are a lot of people that will say, well, wait a minute, I can tune him out anytime, and I don't like what he's saying, that I can't work at my salvation, that he's saying my religion doesn't do me any good, and I'd like to punch him in the nose. Now, I have a man, I play golf with him some. He's a great big fella, and he belonged to a religion, and he said that when I began to listen to you, he said, if I could have got to you, he said, I would have punched you in the nose. You kept telling me I was a sinner, and I was as religious as I could be, and I was in church practically every day. And I said to him, why didn't you just tune me out and you'd been through it? He said, I just wanted to see what you're going to say next, because it all sounded crazy to me. Well, keep listening, friend. Maybe the Spirit of God will do what he did for that fella. It'll make Jesus Christ real to you. And when he becomes real to you, as he did to this man, and he came to the Lord Jesus and he had a wonderful conversion. I say to you today that preaching the gospel does antagonize people. And Paul says, if I'm including something in the gospel, why am I being persecuted? And then he says the offense of the cross ceased. Now, what is the offense of the cross? Well, the offense of the cross is not an intellectual offense, although it is that to some, and it's not an aesthetic offense, although it is that to some people. The thing that he says here is the offense of the cross is that it makes you and me a beggar, and we have to come to the front door of heaven and accept a handout. And that's the only way you will ever get saved, my brother. I had to come like that. Nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. And when you come like that, you're a beggar. You're bankrupt. You haven't anything to offer God for your salvation. And when you come like that to him, you can be saved, friends. You see, actually here, the cross of Christ is an offense to all that man prides himself in. It's offensive to his morality because it tells him his works cannot justify him. It's offense to his philosophy because its appeal is to faith and not to reason. It's an offense to the culture because its truths are revealed to babes. It's an offense to his sense of caste because God chooses the poor and humble. It's an offense to his will because it calls for an unconditional surrender. It's an offense to his pride because it shows the exceeding sinfulness of the human heart. And it's an offense to himself because it tells me I must be born again. You know, that was almost insulting to that Pharisee Nicodemus that night, to tell him, as religious as he was, he must be born again. And that's the reason that a lot of ministers who are preaching the new birth today get in trouble with sometimes some members of the congregation. They don't want to be born again. They feel like they're good enough. It's an insult to you. The cross is an offense, but I don't think we ought to magnify that at all. Now, I had a professor in seminary that said a very wise thing. He said, young gentlemen, do not tone the gospel down. Do not change it. because there is the offense of the cross that today you need to recognize. But he says, don't magnify the offense. Now, I think sometimes the way we give it out, we may become offensive. And when we do that, may God forgive us for that, because I'm sure most of us who attempt to declare the gospel do not want to be offensive personally. We'd like very much for the gospel to be that which is offensive. I said to a man that was on my staff at one time, he antagonized a family and caused them to leave the church. And I told him, I said, now look, I'm the one here to antagonize people. You are not to antagonize them. And I said that I want to be very careful and make sure that I'm not personally the one that antagonizes them, but that the gospel I preach, if anything antagonizes them, let that be the thing that antagonizes people. Not you, not me, actually, but the gospel. I think that is what Paul is saying.